Hey, Ariel. We're going to start. Shuki's going to jump on in a second, but we're going to start the class now of the guitar.
Sure. Yep.
Hey, Aaron. Okay, we're starting the class now in the Talmud. Hold on, let me just ask my Shuki who joins our class if he's coming. Okay. So Gemara, we're holding Gemara Talmud Tractate 78a, 78a, and in the R scroll 78a4. We're starting the new Mishnah. So the Mishnah says as follows: Hamakas chaveri bein be'evan ben be'egrov. A person who hits another person in a way to kill them, whether with a stone or their fist, their hand. V'amdu lemisa, and the strike was such that in court they evaluated the situation and they saw that the person is going to die from his wounds or her wounds. Vehekel mimashahaya, and then the person got lighter, meaning to say that they checked the court again, not just the person felt a bit better, but the court did another medical check on the patient, so to say, and his or her condition improved. And then the Mishnah says hichbid v'meis, and then it got worse again, and then the victim died. So the question is, so the Mishnah says, the rabbis say chayev, the person who did all this, meaning the person who hit the other person, the victim, and eventually, because of the strike, killed him. So that's considered murder, even though the point is that even though there was a bettering of the situation in middle, meaning that the patient had a little bit of a recovery. Again, not a recovery that he felt a bit better or she felt a bit better, but Rashi says that the doctors on behalf of the courts in their examination of the patient said that it seems like he will live from the situation. And Rabbi Nehemiah argues in the rabbis, and he says, Potter, no. Shuraglaim ledavar. We could still say that it's not why he died. He didn't die from the strike, because the very fact that the medical opinion on behalf of the courts found that the patient started to recover and then quickly died, it got worse and then died. So it could be that there's not enough proof that it was done only by the strike of the person, and therefore we can't put the person to death. That's why his wordings are reglaim ledavar. There's feet, meaning there's something you could say that because the medical doctors checked the condition and the condition got better. Okay, so this is the argument between the rabbis and Reb Nechemia. So the Gemara says like this: Tanu Rabbanon, our rabbis learned. So he says, Zu Darish Reb Nechemia. What is the verse? Everything has to come from the Torah. So what is the verse that Reb Nechemia learns to say that if the person becomes better according to the courts in evaluation, that and then afterwards it worsens and he dies, that the person doesn't hey Shuk, you just started the Gemara. The person doesn't, you can't kill the murderer, so to say. So Shuki, we were holding is 80 Ayin Ches Amud Aleph on the bottom of the Mishnah.
You say Ayin Ches?
Ayin Ches Amud Aleph, yes, on the Mamash on the bottom. So the Mishnah says basically, if a person strikes another person with a stone or his hand, and Amduhu Lemisa, meaning that the courts, the medical opinion of the courts, checked the patient, and the patient was going to die from the strike, and vehicle, and then it got better, and not just that he felt a bit better, but they did a second evaluation, and the doctor said, no, it looks like he's actually going to live from this. He's okay. He's going to survive, Baruch Hashem. And then it quickly got worse, and he died. So the rabbis say that okay, but so it got better, it got worse, and now it's all from the same strike, and therefore the person's the murderer. I mean, he killed, he has to be put to death. Rabbi Nechemia says no. Rabbi Nechemia says that because there's reglaim ledavar, there's something you could rely on to assume that possibly you have to have certainty for the courts to kill someone. There has to be certainty, absolute certainty that the person died from the strike. No one's arguing if the person struck him or not. We have witnesses, we have everything. But the question is, maybe he died from another complication. And because we can 100% say that it happened from the strike, why? Because the court doctors themselves evaluated the patient and saw that the patient was on the mend, recovering, and would survive. The point is not that he's just feeling better, but it says v'amdu l'chaim. Means vehikel means what Rashi says. So what does it mean he got better? Not just he feels a bit better, but a lot of people who are sick feel a bit better some days. But amdu l'chaim, the doctors felt that he would survive. So therefore, Rabbi Nechemia says, even though it's most likely it got worse and it didn't end up being as according to the diagnosis, but there's still a chance that it wasn't 100% from that strike. That's the argument. So the rabbis are learning now. We heard in the Gemara. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis learned. As Zu Darish Rabbi Nechemia. This is what Rabbi Nechemia is teaching us. Meaning to say, Rabbi Nechemia has to have a pasuk. What's the verse in the Torah that should hint to us that in such a scenario, that if the courts find that the person should survive from the strike, and after the first thought, means that you have to remember the first evaluation has to be, everyone has to agree, we'll see later in the Gemara, that if the courts initially thought, okay, this is not a strike that's going to kill someone, this person should survive, whatever, you have to pay damages and all that. But then everyone agrees that you can't kill the murderer if things get worse. But here, initially, we thought that he would die, the victim would die from the strike, he or she. Now then we did a second evaluation later, and it looked like the victim started to recover, and then it didn't happen, and the victim ended up dying. So Rabbi Nechemia still has a verse to kind of lean on to say that that we don't put this person to death. What's the verse? If those who have on the side the verses, it says, Im Yaakov Yishalech bachutz. The verse says, after the strike, if the victim gets up and goes outside, meaning starts to move around, Al Mishanta, and he could walk on his own strength, or her strength. Vinika Hamaka, and the so to say the wound gets lessened. So then you don't kill the person, rak shifta yitim v'rapi rapi. So then you have to pay all the other damages that the Torah talks about. There's different damages you pay when you hit someone. You have to pay their doctor bills, you have to pay their shame, you have to pay their loss of work. There's other things that we pay a person for when you hit them, but that's a penalty. That's not, you don't get put to death if the person survives. So Rabbi Nechemia says like this. The verse says, "Im yakom v'yishalech b'chutz." If the person stands up, al mishantoi, on his own or her own power, v'nika hamaka, and so the maka is absolved. It's no longer a person. The person who kills is no longer considered responsible for. It's it. I mean, as far as the death goes, he's not getting put to death, and then he just pays damages. So the Rabbi Nechemia says like this: is there anyone who would think why do we need the pasuk to tell us this? It's obvious if someone punches someone or strikes someone, and it doesn't look good, and then the person heals and goes out. We don't need the Torah to tell us that vinika hamaka, that the person who hit the striker is absolved of not responsibility for healing, but is absolved of the death penalty because the person walked out on the road and the person healed. So obviously, if the person is healthy, that you wouldn't kill the striker, the person who assaulted the other person. So that's what he says. Nechemia says, does anyone think that the person recovers from the strike and is walking around the street? The strike is the market. And nevertheless, we kill the person who strikes. So why do we need the pasuk to tell us that? So obviously the pasuk is telling us another case. It's talking about Amdu'alami. So we're talking about a case where the courts evaluated that the victim should die. And then he got better. Like Rashi says, not just he got better, but we actually evaluated the person to live. That's Rashi's opinion. And then again, it got reinfected, let's say. And hichvid, and it got worse. And then Umeisi dies. Shupat, that he's pater. So Rabbi Nechemia learns the pasuk to say, because if the person walks out and then continues to live his or her life, obviously we don't need the Torah to tell us we wouldn't kill the striker. He didn't murder anyone. So what's the pasuk coming to teach us a chiddush? That if there is a time where the person gets better and the valuation changes and then dies, nevertheless the person who is the person who strikes is absolved from murder, but obviously still responsible to pay because the verse says he has to pay. So who does he pay to? According to Rabbi Nechemia, who does he pay the bills to? The person died. So obviously, according to Rabbi Nechemia, he pays it to the family. So that's how Rabbi Nechemia learns the pasuk, and therefore Rabbi Nechemia supports his view that as long as there's reglaim ledavar, as long as there's feet, so to say, to the claim that possibly the person the victim didn't die from the strike, and he brings a proof from the pasuk that when we see a person walks out to the market, means he gets better to that extent that he's out in the market. So then the pasuk says he's absolved, and that's referring to a person who eventually ends up dying, possibly from that strike. We don't know; it's not 100% certain. So therefore, we can't kill the striker. Well, so what did the rabbis say? If that's the case, so what is the? I just want to see the Rashi. The third Rashi says on the page, El Zeshamdu mitchila lemisa. Like I said, first they evaluate the person that he would die or she would die, person who gets striked. Ubaha kasev l'lamdcha. The verse comes to teach us. Shim yakum min hamishkev. If the person who was stricken then gets up from his or her bed, and he's walking outside, and he's standing and he's evaluated that he would live or she would live. So then the striker is absolved. Even if eventually it sort of say comes back and he dies. But what are the rabbis going to do? The rabbis hold that such a case that's not the law. They don't agree with Rabbi Nechemia. They hold if you strike someone, and even if the person gets better a little bit, but then gets sick again, that you still consider the murderer and you get put to death. So what are they going to do with the verse? Rabbi Nechemia is right. The verse makes sense. So what are they going to say? How are they going to use the word? And if he walks outside, the striker is absolved. Of course, he's absolved. So the rabbis say, well, that no, it's not talking about like Rabbi Nechemia. The pasuk is not talking about a case where a person is evaluated to die from the strike, gets better, seemingly, and then gets sick again and dies. It's talking about another case. It's coming to teach us that when someone strikes someone, and and it looks like the person who is stricken is going to die from the strike. So they wouldn't just let the person, the possible murderer, roam around and wait and see what happens. They would have to put him in prison, so to say, lock him up. Kafshu means they lock him up until they see what happens. If the person dies, so then he gets tried for murder. If the person survives, so then the pasuk says, so if we see him walking out in the shuk and he's healthy, so v'nika hamaka, not that we don't put him to death, that we let him out of prison. At that point, we say, okay, it looks like the victim is going to survive, and therefore no longer we have to retain this person in confinement. So that's why they use the verse for something else. It's not talking about a case, but in the case where a person gets better and then gets worse again, so we would kill him. We would try him at least for murder. And what would happen if we let him off out of prison? So we would recapture him. Okay. So then the Gemara says that's a good question. That's a good point. How does Rabbi Nechemia? Because we must say that we put the person in, we imprison the person, so to say, lock the person up. So where does Rabbi Nechemia learn this from? Rabbi Nechemia chavisha minale. How do we know that we put the person in confinement until we wait to see if the person who is stricken survives or not? So the Gemara says he doesn't need it from the verse. He's Yalif mi Makoshesh. He learns it from the story of the Makoshesh. The story of the Makoshesh is the person who's evidently, according to most opinions, he was Slavchad, the father of the daughters of Slavchad, that the one who chopped wood that we're going to learn about in a few months. That someone went out in the middle of Shabbos in the desert and chopped wood. So the Torah tells us that what happened, that the Makoshesh ate him, they put him in prison until Moshe Rabbeinu was going to figure out what they're going to do to this person. So from here, Rabbi Nechemia says, from the fact that we see that when we are in doubt what the law is, or what's the final law, we imprison someone, we learn it from the person who chopped wood in the desert. So same thing would apply logically to any case where we're in doubt, that we have to retain the person, not let the person run free until we figure out what the ruling is going to be.
How long do we wait?
Well, in the case of murder, we wait as long as the doctors see the situation. If the person walks out, or the doctors say the person's life is no longer in danger, so then we let the person go free. Yes,
Rabbi,
Shuki?
is this the same salafchad with the daughters who come to Moshe about the inheritance laws?
Uh-huh.
It's the same person in the story.
Yeah. So according to the Gemara feels that based on the wording of the daughters of Tzlafcha, that he says that our father didn't die from, the general sins that people did, like the spies or the story of Korach. He died from his own.
Was he one of the spies, or was he?
No. He was
No.
just according to it's not the Gemara that discusses it, but according to the Gemara, Tzlafcha did it for the sake of heaven. He wanted people to realize that the Torah was still valid, even though they were not going to go into the land. So he says, I shouldn't say Rashi again. Rashi says that that we learn from the Vinika Hamakim Lamet Shekayv I say that we imprison him. So based on everyone's questions, so he just describes what happens. Imam Dula Misa. When do we retain a person and imprison him or lock him up? If the Bezdin sees you struck someone strikes someone, and the Bezdin evaluates the person's going to die from the strike, but hasn't died yet. The person who struck him gets locked up, so to say. So he shouldn't run away. Until we see im yamas lav, is the person going to die or not? Therefore, we need the verse to tell us that when we see the person's walking around the streets, then the person who strikes is absolved. The mashma likshiyakum. When the person stands up and is walking around, vinika miklal da adhashta chavashu. From the fact that the pasuk says that when he walks up, only now the person who strikes is absolved, means that until then he was kind of retained. So from there, the rabbis learned that we retain someone. So where does Rabbi Nechemia learn that we retain someone, not in the case of murder, but in general in the case of doubt, in the case of doubt of a death penalty? So they say Yalef Mimakaishish. The Chsiv Rashi says he was kept in a mishmar, means in a watching. So okay, so Rabbi Nechemia has a verse, and now the question is on the rabbis. If we could learn it from the Mechayish and the person who chopped wood on Shabbos, that we retained him, so therefore we learned that in cases of capital doubt, we should retain someone. Why do we need the pasuk in the case of murder to tell us that? We can learn it also from the Mechayish. So v'rabbanan nami leilef Mechayish. Let the rabbis also learn it from Mechayish. So the Gemara says, the rabbi says no. Why? Mechayish bar katluhu. We knew certainly that we had to kill the person who chopped the wood. So it was not even a doubt if the person has to be put to death or not. It was clear. He had witnesses and he had warning, etc. Rashi, Tos was asked about it, but when we just go according to the simple explanation, he had warning and he had witnesses. And therefore, the Torah says in the Ten Commandments, someone who desecrates the Shabbos gets put to death. We learned about that. So that's the law. If you desecrate the Shabbos, you get put to death. So we knew clearly that the person who chops the wood gets put to death. The question was only what death penalty should he get? So that's what the rabbis say. Therefore, we can't learn it in the case where you strike someone, because if the person survives, it's not certain that we're going to put the person to death. Only if the victim doesn't survive. So maybe in such a case, we don't retain someone if we don't know for sure that it's going to be a capital case. In the case of Shabbos, it was surely a capital case, because the Torah tells us someone who desecrates the Shabbos gets put to death. Well, we just didn't know Moshe didn't know what type of death. So that's what he says. The rabbis say no. Let's also learn from the person who chopped wood in the desert that we retain someone until we have the final verdict. The Gemara says no. Everyone who is certain that the person who chopped wood is bar katla has to be put to death. Moshe just didn't know what punishment, what death penalty do we apply to the case of the one who chopped wood. Therefore, we can't learn in this case, our case, the case of a person strikes someone, but we still don't know if the victim will die from the strike, so it may not even be a capital case. We don't even know if the person is a person that's going to be put to death, ilav or not, or ilav bar katlu, or he's not a person that's going to be put to death. So that's a good question from the rabbis. The rabbis are saying you can't apply the case of the person who chopped wood in the desert, that Moshe Rabbeinu retained them, because that case was certain capital case. It just wasn't. We just didn't know what punishment yet. So the Gemara says, what about before we do Rabbi Nechemia? Let's just learn how the Gemara explain. The Rashi explains this. He says, "Mekoishesh bar katlahu." So the Rashi says, "Pshita leila Moshe." Moshe surely knew the bar katlahu, that the punishment was death penalty. Kedai see the commandment of Brisa, as we learn, Yedei hayu Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu knew shemekoishesh b'mitzvah, that the person who chops wood on Shabbos gets put to death. Shari kvar namar already learned in the Torah, mechalel leha mos yumas, one who desecrates the Shabbos gets put to death. However, he didn't know in what death penalty he should get. So Rashi just gives us a side point. Those who know the particulars about the law, so there's a technical problem over here, because the laws of capital case, it's not enough that a witness says, don't do what you're planning to do because you'll be put to death. They have to also say what type of death penalty. So then it kind of goes in a circle. If the witnesses didn't know what kind of death penalty, because even Moshe didn't know what kind of death penalty, so therefore they couldn't properly warn the Makosh Sheitzim, so therefore it's not really a capital case. He wouldn't be put to death. So therefore Rashi just gives us a side note, and he says that the rabbis don't agree with that. The rabbis hold that you don't need to know the death penalty when you warn someone. If you see someone's about to do a sin that you know clearly the Torah says if you do this sin, you get put to death. You can say, don't do it. The Torah says you're not allowed to do it, and you'll get put to death by the Beis Din. But the witnesses are not knowledgeable enough to know what death penalty they'd be put. There's 4 types. That's not a technical problem. The other people don't agree with that. So because the rabbis don't feel that they had to know, so therefore the Makosh Sheishim was certain death because they warned him not to cut the wood. They just didn't know what death penalty he would get. And therefore, it's not a problem, and therefore we could learn from the Mekosher Sheitzim. So we can't learn from the Mekosher Sheitzim, but because it's a certain death, but our case is not certain death. Okay. So what are the so what is the Rabbi Nechemia going to do? Rabbi Nechemia Yalef Mi Megadav. So Rabbi Nechemia also can't learn it from Mekosher Sheitzim because the rabbi's question is a good question. According to Rashi, the Mekosher Sheitz, no, we couldn't even answer that they didn't know the death penalty because then he would never be put to death. There has to be a case where he still may be put to death. So Rabbi Nechemia has to agree with the rabbis on that. So therefore, Rabbi Nechemia can't use anymore the case of Mekosher Sheitzim. So how does he know that we retain someone? And therefore, he's free to use the verse to interpret it as he wants. So therefore, Rabbi Nechemia Yalef Lami Megadev, he learns it from the next case in the desert. There's 2 cases where a person was arrested in the desert. One was the person who chopped wood on the Shabbos, and the other person is the daughter of Shlomit Bas Divri, the son of Shlomit Bas Divri, who cursed God. Megadev means someone who curses God, God forbid. They didn't know the law. They at that point they yet didn't know the law. What happens to the person who, God forbids, curses Hashem chas v'shalom? The kafshru, and therefore they arrested him, waiting to find out what the law is. How do we know that they didn't know? Because the pasuk says, it says lefarish law. It doesn't say what that they retained him to get guidance of what to do to him. That's what the verse says. So therefore, from this we see that like Rashi says, they put him in a watching, meaning like a prison, because it wasn't clear what the law was with him. So here we see that we arrest someone when we're still in doubt. So from this too, someone who hits someone and we're in doubt if it's going to turn into a capital case or not, we see clearly that in such a case we retain someone. And therefore, we don't need our verse to learn that we retain someone. So therefore, our verse is free to learn, according to Rabbi Nechemia, to teach us that if the person strikes and the person who's stricken was evaluated to die and then recovers and then gets sick again and dies, that in such a case, he uses the extra verse because he doesn't need it applied to something else to teach us that we don't apply the death penalty in such a case. So what about the rabbis? The rabbis also could learn it from the case of the person who curses. So why do they need our verse? So the rabbis disagree. The rabbi said, the person who cursed, that was a hayrasha. Hayrasha means it was only something that for the time. It's not something that happens all the time. So from something that happens only at a certain hayrasha is when you have an exclusive situation. The law is you can't learn a general law from an exclusive situation. And the case of the person who cursed in the desert, the rabbis feel that was an exclusive situation. Hayrastra means exclusive situation, and therefore you can't apply it to any other case because that was just a special case. Why? So Rashi says, why was it an exclusive situation? Iloi kasev chavisha dahacha mechavisha dahasim leihav gamrina. If according to Reb Nechemia, if by us we wouldn't according to the rabbis, if by us we wouldn't have the pasuk to teach us that we retain someone who strikes someone, and we have to wait and see what the outcome is, we wouldn't be able to learn it from the case of the Megadev. It was an exclusive case. There was no one ever told him to arrest them. The Jews did it, they did it on their own. It means the Jews saw someone who cursed God, and they themselves took the law, so to say, in their own hand and arrested him. But it wasn't like Moshe said that they have to arrest him. They arrested him and brought him to Moshe. So he says they did it on their own. The kivin never by misa mitchila. There was no indication that he would be put to death yet. There was no reason they should have arrested him. Why would they arrest him? God never did. They never yet learned the law. If you have what you do for a person who curses, so what was the basis for them arresting him? They just did it. They took initiation in their own hands. We're not going to go into if what they did was right or wrong, but that's just what happened. So therefore, the rabbis say you can't learn from an exclusive situation that the Jews took initiation in their own hand, that should be the law in every case. So therefore, that's not an example for us, and therefore, the rabbis need to have a verse in our case, and therefore the verse is not free to teach us what it teaches according to Reb Nechemia, and therefore the rabbis disagree to Reb Nechemia in a case where a person strikes someone, and the Bezdin feels that this person is certainly going to die from the wound, and then miraculously recovers in a way that you feel, okay, it looks like he's going to live, and then he gets sick and dies again, or she. The rabbis say that that case is still considered a capital case, and the person is considered a murderer, and he gets tried for murder. And Rabbi Nechemia says, no, the verse teaches us that in such a case that we let the murderer, so to say, off, although obviously he'll pay in other places, but not according to the courts. Now, the Gemara says, Kedatanya, as we learned, how do we know that it was a Hiras Shah? How do we know that this was an exclusive case, the whole case of the desert? So it says like this. Yedeya Haya Moshe, the rabbis teach us. Yedeya Haya Moshe Rabbeinu Shemakayish B'mitzah. That Moshe knew clearly that in the case of the person who chops wood, that his punishment would be death. He had warning and all that. Shnemar, because the verse says, someone who desecrates the Shabbos gets put to death. But Moshe didn't know what death penalty would he get for desecrating the Shabbos. Shnemar, kiloi foirish. We didn't know yet what the law is, what to do with him. Av Megadev, by the case of Megadev, we're turning the page, those who are in the art scroll, to 78b2. But in the case of the Megadev, the person who curses, the pasuk says they have to ask God in general what to do to him. We didn't even know if this is punishable by death. Maybe this is not a violation that's punishable by death. Imlav or not. So therefore, we see clearly that the Mekoshish Eitzim, the Moshe was arrested, he arrested him because of a certain death. In the case of Megadev, they didn't know what to do, so therefore they retained him. But it's not because it doesn't prove anything. So the Gemara says like this. What's the Gemara news? Bishleim Rab Nechemia. Okay, so stop here. So therefore the rabbis say that it's a Hiras Shah, it's only an exclusive case. Obviously Rab Nechemia doesn't feel it's an exclusive case. Anytime we're in doubt, we retain someone until we see the outcome. Okay. Now the Gemara is going to say like this. The pasuk says, again, in the pasuk that says that when you strike someone, that you get put to death, the pasuk says like this. After you strike someone, the pasuk uses two evaluations of what. Let's bring up let me just bring up the verse. They don't have it over here. Hold on. I'm just going to bring up the verse that the Gemara is talking about over here. Just give me a second. This is all in last week's Parsha, actually. So actually, I should have it in the Chumash right here. It says like this. The verse teaches us like this. Okay. Vehika is someone who hits another person. It says Vehika ish Esrei, someone who hits another person. Ve'evnoi be'egref with a stone or your fist. V'lo yamos, but the person doesn't die yet. V'nafel mishkav, but falls sick from the strike. So then the pasuk says Im Yakum, if he stands up v'nika maka, so then the person who strikes is absolved. Rak shiftoi yitin, he has to give all the different penalties. V'rapi rapa, he has to heal him. So the pasuk says. In there it says v'lo yamos. The verse says that if you hit someone and he doesn't die, and then it says the verse should have just said if someone hits another person with a fist or a hand and he falls sick. So why does he have to say and he doesn't die? If he falls sick, obviously he's not dead. So why does the pasuk have to say he doesn't die? And also it says if he stands up and he walks outside, then the person is absolved. Again. It's telling us two things. One, that the person doesn't die, and then another thing is that the person, if he's well, that the person is absolved. So that's also that it's obvious, again, if the person stands up, then obviously the murderer is not a murderer, he didn't kill anyone. So the Gemara says like this. So he goes, I understand that according to the rabbis, according to Nehemiah, there's two evaluations. That one evaluation is if a person was evaluated to die and then lives, so then the person's absolved. The second one is to teach us that if a person is evaluated to die, and then it gets better, and then he dies, then also the person is let off. That's why we have to have two evaluations. Because if he evaluates and he lives to die and then he lives, and then we let him off. And he's let off if he's evaluated to die, he then gets better and then he dies, then he ends up dying. So the Torah has to teach us both those cases. El Rabbanan who don't agree, they can hold in the case where a person's evaluated to die, gets better and then dies, then that's considered murder. So El Rabbanan Trei Amdu Lamali, why do we have to have two cases where we evaluate? One evaluation. If the person's going to die, he he lives, then you get off. If he doesn't live, then you're a murderer. Well, there's no two cases. It's either he lives or he doesn't live. So the Gemara answers, Chadam du lemisa v'chaya. One case is to teach us in the case where he was evaluated to die and he lives. V'chad amdu l'chayim v'meis. But there's another case, rabbis say. What about a case where you evaluate the person initially to live and then he dies? So in that case also, then because there wasn't, the case where the rabbis and the Nehemiah argue has an initial evaluation of death. Only happens afterwards comes a second evaluation. Eventually the patient starts to recover and we say that he's going to live and then he dies. But everyone agrees seemingly that if initially in the courts he was evaluated to live and then he ends up dying, then no one argues that he wouldn't be put to death. Because the first evaluation in the court was he's supposed to live, and that's that. So that we go with the first evaluation. So the rabbis say that's why we have to have two parts of the pasuk. One is to teach us what happens if he's expected to live and then he dies, and the other one is if he's expected to die and then he lives. So in both those cases, then the person is absolved from he's not considered. He doesn't get tried for murder. Again, this doesn't mean he gets off scot-free, but we're just talking about the cases of the Bezdin has to try him for murder. So again, the Rabbanan, Treyam do lamali, Chadam do lamisa v'chai. One case where they evaluated him to die and he ends up living, and the Chad in one case, Amdu l'chaim, they felt he would live, and Mace, and he ends up dying. So Rabbi Nehemiah is another question. Rabbi Nehemiah, how do we know such a case that if he's evaluated to live and then he dies, that he should be pater? I mean, maybe that's what it means. Maybe how do we know to tell us an extreme case that he's evaluated to die and then to live and then die, that he's absolved? Maybe the pasuk's not referring to that. So the Gemara says, Reb Nechemia amdu l'chaim v'meis lo tzarich kra. The Reb Nechemia says that if a person's evaluated to live and then dies, we don't need a pasuk to tell us that we don't try him. Shariyatzimi bezdin zakai. Because once you walk out of the court vindicated, then it's too late. We can't try him again. There's no double jeopardy. Okay. Let's just finish to the Mishna. I have to go in a few minutes. Our rabbis learned a person who strikes a person and he's evaluated to die, and then he lives. Obviously the person gets off. Amdul lemisa, they evaluated him to die, and it got better. So then we check him again. The mamain, to find out what kind of damages he has to pay. What happens if afterwards he ends up dying from that? We go after the middle evaluation, which was that he was going to live. This is the opinion of Rabbi Nechemia. The rabbis say, we don't do a second evaluation. Okay, that's one case. We see another case where they argue. Tanya, another case we learned. What happens if we evaluate a person that he is going to die from the strike? Sorry, Tanya Amdu Lemisa, Aimdim Isai Lachayim, Lachayim ain't Aimdim Isai Lemisa. That if Aimdu Isai Lemisa, then we check again to see if he's going to live. But if we once we check for him, if he's going to live the first time and we see he's going to live, we don't check again to see if he's going to possibly get worse and die. So it says, Ein Aimdim Isai Lemisa, Amdu Lemisa. What happens if we evaluate him to die? He gets better. What he thought. So and then we check to see what kind of financial damages he has to pay. But if he dies after that, so what does he do with the financial things that he has to pay? The person now died. He has to pay the damages, the financial damages to the people who inherit his estate. When does he have to pay? From the time he hit him. So we don't look at his value of when he dies. He's worth less. Of when he was hit, he was worth a lot more. The damages were much more damaging when the person was healthy. And who's that opinion? That's the opinion of Rabbi Nechemia. Right, sorry we had to finish off fast because I have to go to a call. But either way, Chevra, we finished this Mishna, so I'm happy that we got some ground today. And we're holding, so the conclusion of this sugya is basically that the conclusion of the sugya basically is that there's an argument between the rabbis and Rabbi Nechemia in one case. In the case where a person strikes another person and the doctors of the courts evaluate that this person would die from the strike, he recovers and then ends up getting worse and dying. According to the rabbis, that he gets put to death because it's one strike. And according to Rabbi Nechemia, because there was in between an emtza, where he was meant to live, and then it got worse, there's not enough proof that he dies from the strike, and therefore it's not strong enough case to try him for murder, or to conclude that he is a murderer. All right, everyone, have a Laila Tov. Thank you for joining. Take care. See you next week. Shavua Tov.